This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
I woke up a little later than normal this morning, so you'll have to pardon me if I'm a little groggy one of those nights. And by that, I mean I was basically up until midnight trying to catch up on this latest episode of Dynamite. Long day kind of prevented me from getting home until around 8:15 or 8:30 last night. So after eating dinner and trying to catch up on a few other things, by the time I actually sat down to watch Dynamite, it's probably already a little after 10 o'clock. So, yeah, that was how my Thursday night concluded. Getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning to do my daily work schedule and closing things out by watching AEW Dynamite. No wonder I had nightmares and couldn't sleep. You know the old catchphrase, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink? For AEW, I think it's, you can give Tony Khan a pencil and paper, but that doesn't mean he's going to have a single clue of how to write a good wrestling show. Been waiting on that for the better part of 3 years. Judging how their ratings have been going, I don't think a lot of other people are waiting. I think they've given up. It's sad. It's really sad. You know, as much as I like to come on here and bury the show, talk about how bad it is more often than not, at some point, even I have to ask myself, when does it become the law of diminishing return? I'm trying to think. I've been doing these AEW reviews for a little over a year now, right? I think I started reviewing Dynamite on this channel back in like the summer of 2021. Maybe the fall. But it's been over a year for sure. I need to go back in my free time and try to watch a few of those old Dynamite reviews I did from like September or October of 2021. With CM Punk jumping into the fold again, Bryan Danielson leaving WWE and coming over. And it probably seems like ancient history at this point, but y'all remember that period about a year or so ago when all those guys' contracts were expiring in the WWE and everybody wanted out, thinking the grass was going to be greener on the other side with AEW? And then everyone quickly came to find out that they were all being sold a bill of goods. And now most of the same former WWE guys now want out of their contracts. You know, you reap what you sow. Sorry to say. But I'll even openly have to admit that I was at least somewhat optimistic about AEW's future around that point. Like, especially when Punk signed. That just felt like a total breath of fresh air in this company. If I would have been able to predict where things would have gone shortly thereafter, probably would have changed my outlook. I'd have said, maybe this isn't the best environment for Punk to be involved with, because look at the people he has to work with. You know, but again, you never know how things might churn out. All I know is that, you know, we've been in this post-Punk era of AEW for going on what now? 6 months? I mean, it really has been that long. Hard to imagine. I have my own personal opinions about the direction AEW's gone since the whole brawl out media scrum session. I mean, you know by listening to my recaps that I haven't particularly enjoyed a lot of it. But I'm just one piece of the overall pie in this whole discussion. You look at how people have been responding to this with the way everybody's been viewing the product. Since Punk's been gone, love him or hate him, has AEW seen a vast increase in overall viewership? I think that one's pretty apparent. The answer is no. Has the general company morale been a lot better since Punk's departure? No. I mean, you'll have the elite guys trying to drum up all this nonsense about how things are better with Punk out of the equation, but we all know that's a lie. Because everybody's divided into their own little camp groups now, and it's been that way for at least a year. And now you got stories circulating that a bunch of guys want out of their contracts and aren't happy being there. You know, and while some people have probably been quieter than others, I think that story is only scratching the surface of the overall problem. And again, it doesn't directly tie back into everybody kind of being divided on that roster, but there is an issue there. And I'm not going to go into a whole State of the Union address for AEW right now. All I'm going to say is that, you know, as we lead into this Dynamite report in a few minutes, try and see the show for what it is. Okay? If you're going to try and objectively tell me that things are looking up for AEW now compared to where things were in mid to late 2021, even early 2022, at best, at the very best, you're lying to yourself. And at the worst, you're clearly delusional. And admittedly so, I did not mentally prepare myself going into this one. Not that there's ever really a correct way for me to mentally prepare to watch Dynamite. It's kind of just same drill every week. You go in expecting random chaotic shit to happen. That's pretty much what you get. It's the one common trait you can always expect with AEW. Nothing's going to make sense, and no one's going to have a single clue what's going on from week to week, up to and including the people working in the company. And I don't think anything could more perfectly exemplify that than how this show started. And unfortunately, I hate being that guy, especially factoring in that he's pretty much the only redeeming quality about this product. But I've got to throw some shade at MJF's involvement in this thing. I can probably count on one hand the amount of MJF segments in AEW's 3-year history that I can say I've outright detested. This one right here, it may rank among the worst things I've ever seen him involved with. Not since the days of the Jericho feud have I actually said to myself, that was a really, really bad MJF segment. And no, it has nothing to do with me being a Jew hater, so piss off. It has everything to do with the fact that once upon a time, back when we actually may have had a modicum of faith in this AEW company and that it was going to be an actual alternative, the people running this operation promised us that All Elite Wrestling would be a sports-based wrestling company. Y'all remember that? Remember when we actually bought the idea that AEW was going to be driven by statistics and numbers and data, and that it wasn't just going to wind up being a watered-down, piss-poor knockoff of WWE? Yeah, we all drank the Kool-Aid at one point. I get it. It's all good. We all learn from our mistakes. Never trust a beta-tized billionaire who gets his advice from a bunch of whiny, antisocial soy boys who play video games all day. Who'd have ever thunk that? So with that said, I go back to a very simple question that I've asked about a lot of low-rent WWE segments that AEW's presented on their sports-driven wrestling show. You look at a segment like how they opened up with Dynamite this week, and you got MJF doing this dressed-up bar mitzvah. They got the balloons set up, the confetti's going off, MJF's wearing his wacky gear for all this. They got the girls choreographed to walk him down the aisleway. Not to mention whatever in the fuck that dance routine was with the geeks running down with the chair. Now again, you'll have to pardon my ignorance with my lack of knowledge pertaining to bar mitzvahs. I'm not Jewish, nor am I really interested in watching a wrestling show cosplay a bar mitzvah party on their TV show because, oh, did I mention, it's a fucking wrestling show? God damn it, son. You know, I thought guys getting their own talk segments on Raw was the most insufferable in-ring promo segment wrestling shows could ever book. And I'm watching MJF out there for the first 5 minutes of the show doing whatever in the fuck this was. I'm sorry, this just pissed me off to no end. MJF is the only good thing about this show most weeks. And here, am I crazy? Or did this almost come off like they were intentionally trying to make this guy do bad comedy for the fuck all of it? Just because Tony knows he's the only redeeming thing about this show from week to week consistently. So it's like he had to throw it back in all of our faces by saying, no, MJF can participate in all the comedy clown show stuff too. So suffice it to say, I hated that part. And unfortunately, it really didn't get any better when the peanut gallery started filing out in, again, typical WWE fashion, where people just interrupt the segment in single file fashion. Everybody gets their theme music playing for their entrance, which makes it that much more apparent that dudes are just waiting in gorilla for their music to hit. Because, you know, the shit is fake, you see. In the case of all the guys that interrupted here are the list of names. Jungle Boy, followed by Sammy Guevara, followed by Darby Allin. I believe amongst all three men that were involved here, there was a sum total of 4 words spoken before guys started interrupting at a given time. Because, well, check out the names for one. All 3 of them are drywall personalities to begin with. None of them could say suey if the hogs had them. Just 3 completely blank, boring, uninspiring Gen Z lame brains. Meanwhile, MJF looking like fucking Ric Flair standing next to these numbskulls. And after MJF dresses them all down for a minute, he asks them all collectively what they want, and just like they all rehearsed prior, in very overly scripted delivery, they all simultaneously went, I want a title shot. And it sounded about as lifeless as my delivery. That was intentional, by the way. I just thought to myself, so these are the 4 pillars Tony Khan was talking about 6 months ago when they were printing those t-shirts, huh? That's a pretty mid set of AEW's future, if I'm being blunt. MJF excluded from the conversation, obviously. That goes without saying. The other 3, I have no signs of hope for. So, now they kind of followed a formula with this. Everybody got to take turns passing the microphone around. Started with Jungle Boy. He gets on the stick and starts talking about the last time he and MJF met in the ring. 3 years ago at the first Empty Arena Scamdemic pay-per-view, where MJF cheated and won, like he always does. Fact. Says that while he, Darby, and Sammy wrestled on Dark, Elevation, and Rampage and took a back seat on the show, MJF got to walk around on Dynamite and get opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. Fact. And while most people in the locker room are lucky to get 60 seconds of TV time most weeks, MJF gets 15 to 20 minutes consistently. Fact. He says, this company revolves around MJF, which is also fact. I'm failing to see how this is supposed to get heat on MJF. Like, I'm listening to Jungle Boy talk, and I'm like, yeah, what's your point? Of course, MJF gets more opportunities than the majority of the roster. It's because he's good and everybody else fucking sucks. This is groundbreaking news in 2023. Jungle Boy is literally just picking up on this. And even MJF basically put Jungle Boy in his place and said, yeah, this company does revolve around me because unlike everybody else in the back, I'm an actual star. By the way, this did not garner heat for MJF. People actually cheered that statement because, again, they know it's fact. Which then led Sammy Guevara to do his own self-owned promo where he basically inferred that he had to work minimum wage jobs while he was wrestling to even get a foot in the door. Yet again, reaffirming MJF's statement that he's an actual star and everybody else is inferior by comparison. But I don't know, I guess it was cool because Sammy was defending the common man. Or maybe because he spilled a bunch of insider terms like job guy and independence and getting pushed by the machine. What an idiot. I'm glad the fans booed this scrawny, petulant, crash dummy, nothing happening ass. Only took the people 3 years to figure out that this Sammy Guevara was just another indie goof that does all the flips and dives and has nothing resembling superstar potential. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut a time or two, I guess. Then Darby started ranting about something involving him dropping out of school, something about him promising himself that whether he failed or succeeded as a wrestler, he was never going to change anything about himself, which, my God. Talk about underlying hidden messages. That statement right there, that's going to be the cap when AEW finally goes under. No wonder none of these young fucks ever get any better in the business. They really are so caught up in the smell of their own wet farts. They actually have the mindset that they don't need to change a damn thing about their personality in order to get better. They think they got it made. They're on TV. They got signed to a major wrestling company. They're working for a billionaire. Clearly they know what they're doing. Clearly they don't need to take advice from anybody that's, I don't know, had experience in the business or knows how to actually draw money. Go figure. And we heard it. Plain as day. From the horse's fucking anal cavity. Darby Allin. Spitting the quiet part out loud. You really can't make this stuff up, folks. You really can't. And right at the point he starts admonishing MJF for bitching and griping about his contract, he asks him, you know what I'm going to do if you do not give me a title shot? To which I said, what? Go bitch about it on Twitter? Go jump off a 50-foot building into flaming shards of glass? What, dive off a bridge into a river full of jagged rocks? What are you going to do, Darby? Just, what is your master plan in all of this? If MJF were to say, no, I don't want to wrestle any of you bums, because none of you are worth my time and you all suck, get out of my fucking ring. Which is essentially what he said. And, well, it's funny because right as the thought was passing in my mind that Darby was going to mention something about complaining on Twitter, sure enough, he makes a passive joke about it less than 3 seconds later. Nailed that one. But no, his punchline is, I'm going to beat you with a headlock takeover. Oh, I get it. Just like how MJF beat you on the last pay-per-view when you guys wrestled. Thanks for the reminder. I'd completely forgotten about that. So, the long and short of this interminable segment was essentially MJF roasted these guys on the stick for about another minute, said none of them could lace his boots. He halfway ripped off Cornette's thank you, fuck you, bye catchphrase. And then right as he was going to leave, he tried to paintbrush Jungle Boy, but Jungle Boy decked him from behind. Guevara gave Jungle Boy a running knee, which then sent Jungle Boy down, falling directly onto Max's right leg. which looked like it sucked. And because MJF had mentioned a cake 30 seconds prior, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out where that was headed. Darby and Sammy get into a scuffle, which led to Darby shoving Sammy into MJF. MJF went flying into the table and attempted to land face first in the cake. Pretty much missed his face entirely, but he tried to sell it. All of this was pretty much a long-winded way of me saying, if this was how Tony Khan came up with 3 babyface number 1 contenders for MJF to feud with over his title, this was an awful way to build it up. And, all joking aside, and beyond the fact that this did nothing more than just outright expose the fact that none of these guys can still cut a promo worth of shit, can anybody rationally explain to me how all 3 of these guys are now number 1 contenders for the AEW World Championship? Out of the 3 challengers involved here, Sammy Guevara's last TV match was him getting shoehorned into the middle of a throwaway ladder match, which he didn't even win. He also lost in the main event, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Darby's been MIA since he dropped the TV title back to Samoa Joe in that random street fight they had weeks ago. I don't think we've even seen him on TV since. And Jungle Boy, I mean, in all fairness, okay, he did just beat Christian at the last pay-per-view, so you can maybe argue that he's got a valid case. But, I mean, with the way he's been featured and presented for the last year on this show, you honestly going to sit there with a straight face and tell me that Jungle Boy comes off like a main event star right now? This whole thing, the epitome of Mark booking. When people ask you, what is a simplistic definition of what Mark booking is? This segment. Tony had an idea for something. He said, let's throw all the original 4 pillar guys into the ring for a segment and try to artificially build up some people to feed to MJF because he needs opponents, basically. Leaving out the most crucial part, the fact that none of this makes a goddamn lick of sense from a booking standpoint. Have Darby, Sammy, and or Jungle Boy been booked like top guys in the last 6 months? Have they been featured or utilized as top guys? Have they all been given high-profile signature wins on pay-per-views to help build up their credibility? Collectively, among all 3 of them, the answer is an undisputable no. And anyone that tries to argue that is just flat out lying. So really, when you narrow all of this down to its core, I mean, sure, Tony threw together some interim challengers that MJF would be able to go over. And then what? You just going to go back to using all 3 of these guys like total nothing burgers? The same way you've been featuring them for the last year? I mean, the bloom's kind of off the rose with these guys to begin with. No one sees them as top credible challengers at this point. Discount the marks, their opinion doesn't really count. But seriously, what do you do with them afterwards? Okay, so let's say 3 weeks out from now on TV, they book MJF and Jungle Boy. TV match for the World Championship. Okay. Fine. MJF's going to go over. So what do you do with Jungle Boy then? Do you have a plan? Mr. Long-Term Booker Tony Khan? Or are you just going to have him go back to wrestling on Dark and Rampage again? Give him a minute of screen time every month or so until you figure out what you want to do with him. Basically validating what they were saying in this promo segment. And the same goes for Darby and Sammy too. I mean, I could say more about this if I really wanted to, but really, I think the entire segment itself spoke volumes. I already hated the Bar Mitzvah crap to begin with. That was at least somewhat short and painless. You know, and once MJF started tearing down all the guys in the stick, it momentarily got better. Although, to be fair, I don't think it's exactly the best impression to make when your heel is clearly outclassing the babyfaces on every level, and the fans are vociferously booing a third of your said babyfaces because he's an insufferable douchebag. But again, what do I know? I'm just some geek on the internet that reports the obvious. It's almost as bad as a self-serving Chris Jericho publicity stunt, where Tony Khan continues to give this guy a platform to stroke his ego every week. It's got to be nice. Getting some kind of artificial reward from the Canadian government. Trying to make a guy seem more important than he really is. Sounds like modern politics and or Hollywood, where people are literally rewarded for just existing, even though they're the most useless human beings that are breathing on this planet. So at this stage, we were about 20 minutes into the show, and I was already one notch above roid rage mode. So you'll be shocked to hear that when I found out the next match was the BCC taking on Adam Page in the job order, I was about 5 seconds away from kicking a hole through my TV. Instead, I just chose to boycott the segment entirely and not even bother indulging in whatever Jon Moxley had in store for his weekly garbage match fetish. Because seriously, why would I even bother at this point? Look at the people involved. It's Jon Moxley and Adam Page in their 87th match. Literally, after I just got done witnessing these two slice each other open like Swiss cheese on pay-per-view, now I have to sit here on TV 2 weeks later and watch them go at it again? For literally no reason at all. No, fuck you. I'm done with this crap. Every single one of these guys can go eat a dick. And I hate to have to throw Claudio into that equation too, but as long as he's affiliated with the oil mechanic and the kid that looks like your average Joe working the customer service booth at Best Buy, I can't take him seriously. The whole thing's a joke. The job order just have go-away heat with me at this point. Adam Page is boring beyond all hope. No, not happening. That match ate up about 15 minutes of camera time. Just in time for me to come back and watch Jade Cargill beat some other random chick in a short match for her title, wherein the only thing I asked myself when it was over was, this is a thing that is still going on? They're still running with the Jade Cargill undefeated streak? Wow. Talk about making no progress. I think I was more shocked to learn that they've been running with this story for seemingly what feels like 8 years. She still has not cracked 60 wins yet. Doesn't it seem like she should be closing in on at least triple digits? At the least? Considering how long this crap's been going on? Do people even still care at this point? Hard to imagine they could. Speaking of not caring, I'm going to ask a very similar follow-up question to the idea of Ricky Starks feuding with Juice Robinson of all people. Does anybody care? Like, come on now. Do you? Do you really? No, you don't. Again, you're lying if you say you do. There's just no way to maneuver around that argument. I can also say the same for QT Marshall and whatever in the fuck this VTR was, with whatever spinoff they were trying to parody here. What was this even? You had QT and a bunch of goons sitting in a conference room doing horrible, overly rehearsed verbiage about God even knows what. Mocking Wardlow for the car break-in last week. There's some blonde dressed in a schoolgirl outfit with a British accent. I mean, her acting was the most hideous of the bunch. And meanwhile, in all of this nonsense, there's Powerhouse Hobbs sitting around like a dork, being a total non-factor in everything. Because, you know, it's 2023. So obviously that means we're still trying to get QT Marshall over, right? Yeah. Just like they were trying to do 10 years ago in Ring of Honor, and the people are shitting all over it then because it's QT fucking Marshall. The guy was always hot garbage. Sorry, not sorry, Jim. I'm siding with the Marks on this one. We all saw through that BS. QTV, they called this, huh? How about cue the TV remote so I can turn this fucking shit off and watch something else, like I imagine everybody else did. I wish that something else didn't involve the company mascot. But you know, we're going to pump the brakes for a split moment here, because I was mildly curious about this one. You all know my controversial take on Orange Cassidy. And really, the take isn't even controversial. I just think the gimmick fucking sucks, and the dude playing the character is a rotten professional wrestler. But I've got to admit, Tony had me hooked here. They announced this on last week's show. At first glance, I was like immediately ready to poon it. But I gave it some thought. And I'm like, I have to see how they pull this off. I have to see if or how Jeff Jarrett is capable of getting a halfway watchable match out of this jag off. And the answer? Well, the guy's not Henry Houdini, but somehow, some way, Jeff was able to pull off a miracle. Probably the closest anybody's ever come to getting a remotely watchable match out of the Denim mascot. It was by far one of the more logically constructed Orange Cassidy matches I've ever seen. Mostly thanks to Double J yucking up the stupidity of the gimmick to the max. You know, the spots where he was putting his hands down his trunks and doing the lazy kicks to Cassidy, laughing at the sheer absurdity of the whole thing, just being a dick. I mean, he was essentially letting everybody in on the fact that the gimmick is a joke. Not that we already didn't know that. Probably the most shocking thing in the entire match was seeing Orange Cassidy actually get the 1-2 punch exchange spot right. I mean, you could tell Jeff actually led the charge and told Cassidy to lay into him to make it look believable. Also, as he'd have had Cassidy throwing windmill punches and making Jeff look like a moron. And then, of course, they had to overbook the living dog shit out of it to make it even semi-work. All of it was straight out of the Memphis playbook with the run-in spots, the ref bump to Bryce Remsburg, the gimmick tease where Jarrett was about to use the guitar, but then Aubrey Edwards came in the back door and took it away. You know, they even did the old Eddie Guerrero spot where Satnam tries to snag the guitar from Cassidy, but Cassidy taps Aubrey on the shoulder and feigns the injury so Aubrey can eject the heels. It's right out of the territory playbook. I actually thought they should have just taken it home when Jay Lethal ran into Club Cassidy with the Golden Glove gimmick, because that would have been the perfect heat finish, but no, they had to have Cassidy kick out. Then, of course, here comes Trent to thwart Lethal on the floor. Those guys end up brawling to the back. And it winds up with Cassidy countering a stroke and hitting Jeff with the Roman Reigns Superman punch for the 3. Total wrong finish. Like, Jeff should have won this thing. But, yeah, like I said, man, I've had some fairly harsh things to say about Jeff Jarrett in the past. And I rescind none of those statements because history is on my side in a lot of those cases. But he somehow pulled this off. I don't know how, but he did. Jeff Jarrett managed to actually get me to willingly sit through an Orange Cassidy match on TV. And it was moderately decent by usual standards. It'll never happen again, guaranteed. By far, this was easily the worst Jeff Jarrett match I've probably ever seen. You know, it just goes to show you how horrible the fucking Orange Cassidy gimmick is, and has always been. You know, but at the end result is him handing the mascot the only semi-watchable or moderately tolerable match he's ever going to have in his entire career. I think Double J deserves at least some credit. There is a trade-off there. It's probably saying a lot at this point. The fact that I went through an entire episode of Dynamite wherein the only match that I watched from beginning to end was a match involving Orange fucking Cassidy. That's really what we've come to. Waving the proverbial white flag. It was certainly more interesting than watching a bunch of catty girls scream and act like a bunch of unbearable harpies for 5 minutes straight. Which is exactly what Ruby, No-Go, Saraya, and Toni Storm did. I got through about 90 seconds of that and avoided the rest of it like the plague. Just absolute turn the channel heat. Just no way around it. And after skipping over a few more meaningless pre-tapes and VTRs to hype up matches for the Friday show that nobody watches, well, it took us to the main event. One that will probably live in infamy. In a match that I wish I was making up, but unfortunately I'm not. For 20 minutes straight, we got whatever you even try to term this trio's main event with the Elite, JAS, and the House of Drek. The spectacle, inexperience, an abomination. Well, I guess I should start with this. I noted a few minutes ago that the only match I watched from start to finish was the Orange Cassidy match. That doesn't directly mean that I didn't at least try to subject myself to a little bit of this match. I didn't get all the way through it, but I really tried. Until all the usual nonsensical gymnastic tumbling routines kicked in with the Beta Bucks, it was moderately tame, considering a lot of the people involved. Admittedly so, the only thing people really wanted to see in the whole thing was Jericho and Omega. And then, of course, when they did finally touch for the first time, all they did was throw a few horrible fake windmill punches before getting cut off. What a payoff, right? Now, of course, they ended up doing some stuff later on, which then got me thinking. You know, I was just sitting here not that long ago. I think it was during my pay-per-view recap where I talked about the Elite as a group and how futile the entire trios division has been from the start. Talking about how better served everybody might be if they had Omega maybe work a few singles matches at some point to try and actually engage in some moderately decent business for a change. I just think, can you imagine if they spent, I don't know, 2 weeks building up a big rematch showdown between Jericho and Omega for this show? Without all the involvement with the JAS and the House of Drek nonsense, just a straight one-on-one match with Jericho and Omega in Winnipeg. Kind of hard to think that wouldn't have maybe boosted viewership numbers a smidge, don't you think? Probably wouldn't have put them over the million mark, but they could have maybe settled in at a comfortable 900,000 or so. Because I think people actually would have been genuinely curious to see that match. You know, especially if you took the time to build that up on television and show footage of the last time Omega and Jericho met in the ring together. You know, instead of trying to involve 7 other bodies in a chaotic match, which really didn't do anything for anybody involved anyway, because again, all people really wanted to see was Omega and Jericho. You know, maybe it's just wishful thinking on my end. I certainly would have been more on board with a singles match between Omega and Jericho. Probably would have watched the whole thing. And I can't stand either one of those douchebags. But I'll even admit to something when it could conceivably work and do good numbers. But instead, they just muddled everything up with trying to involve 9 dudes at once. As per usual in these kinds of environments, tags are totally worthless. It all just breaks down into everybody trading spots in and out of the ring. There's no legal guy. There's no clear-cut face or heel. You can't follow any of the shit that's going on. And to top it all off, the finish is flatter than a plate full of piss. They do a million false finishes and high-impact moves, all of which are seemingly less impressive looking than the one prior. And then the HOB just hit one of Jericho's teammates with their finish and get the pin. And the crowd doesn't even react. They didn't even give it a resounding boo. They literally just sat there and remained quiet for another minute and a half until the show went off air with more pandemonium. In this case, it was the job order and the BCC randomly making their way down to continue a brawl that apparently ensued at one point earlier in the show and just bled over for another hour and a half until we got to this point. So yeah, that was apparently a show-running angle that I completely missed out on. Just a totally random BCC job order brawl that lasted for well over an hour and nobody ever thought to, send in security to break it up. Like how every fucking brawl gets broken up on this show, with geeks filing out to try to separate people. No. Apparently nobody ever thought to do that for well over an hour. They just let the BCC and the job order fight in the back. Did nothing to try and stop it. Also, the fight could spill out to the ring later on and end with the Elite standing behind Adam Page to come to his aid. Because that's really what we need to see, is more story development with Adam Page and the Elite goons. As if the drunken millennial cowboy gimmick didn't kill his career dead in the water when he was filming all those horrible skits with the Beta Bucks and Omega for weeks on end. Now I have to be reminded of that. I try to block it from memory, but nope. Gotta hammer it into my head yet again. And of course, it brings up the obvious question of, what's this all leading to? My follow-up question is, why do I care? But I think I already know the answer to that. The answer is I don't. But trying to be objective about it. You can obviously see what they're trying to set up here. It'll probably be some kind of Survivor Series type match with the BCC guys wrestling the Elite, which evidently means that they're going to wind up wedging poor Danielson into this clown fest. I'm clearly not the audience for whatever this is going to end up being. I can't stand either one of these groups or pretty much anybody involved. Again, Claudio may be being the exception to the rule, but he's really not doing himself any favors by being associated with it. It'll be something that I critique more heavily once I kind of figure out what it's all leading to and whether or not it makes my eyes bleed as a result. I don't know, it'll probably be some kind of stupid War Games gimmick or something. It'll suck a mass cock, see the people involved. Mox will bleed like a faucet. The Bucks will do all their choreographed dance theater tricks. Omega will do all his constipated looking facial expressions, and everybody else will be there to fill the void. Just more chaos and nonsensical pandemonium. Just like how everybody in this company likes it. And that's why this company's in the damn shape it's been in for the better part of a year. Honestly, that's all I've got. I don't normally even take the time to bother talking about the ratings. It's pretty self-explanatory when you watch the show. You can sort of get a sense of how the overall viewership number is going to do by the end of segment 2 or segment 3. Apparently this week they dipped pretty substantially in the overall rating on cable, or the overall ranking on cable. I think last week they treaded around 860,000 overall. This week it was maybe a hair down from that. I think I read the report was something like 853,000 people. It's not good, but it's not a significant drop-off from the previous week, all things considered. But this is the same company that a year ago was doing 1 million viewers every week when Punk was on the show. And the product actually had a little bit of buzz behind it. You kind of saw where the top feuds were going, even if some of the middle area of the card was the usual dreck. It's almost like there's a pattern circulating. Punk's on the show, ratings go up. Lose Punk altogether, ratings dip pretty markedly. Who'd have ever thought that? Who'd have ever thought losing their best star they ever had in their company history was going to drive people away? And of course, you watch the show and you're like, well, duh. No wonder they're running people off in spades. Look at the matches, for one. You know, they're essentially going right back to old habits of how they used to structure the show back in like 2020, when Tony Khan was still buying the idea that all the indie geeks were going to carry the load for his product. So he'd constantly book a bunch of green outlaw guys on TV every week. Turns out that doesn't always make for the most compelling show. But it's more than that too, because, you know, I've talked about how the honeymoon phase for this company is long since expired. I was saying that over a year ago when people started to actually acknowledge the cracks unfolding with the booking. And then I said, well, typically this is how things go when there's a new toy on the market. People artificially buy the BS that the new toy is going to be great. People buy the product. They realize that it's not as great as it was chalked up to be. They get bored with it, and they move on. That's pretty much what's happened with Dynamite. You know, because even as far back as 2019, 2020, even 2021, regardless of how terrible the booking has always been, you know, you still had a good chunk of people watching the show figuring that, hey, maybe things are actually going to get better over time. Tony's new at this. He doesn't have a lot of experience, so, you know, let's give him a while to kind of find his footing and figure out where he's going to take things. Figuring that they were eventually going to get a payoff to all the marks that kept propping this company up as the greatest thing since sliced bread. That it was going to be a real legit alternative. By last year, when it was apparent that everybody was being lied to, well, you started to see people dropping off more consistently. The Punk story at the All Out Media Scrum was the icing on the cake. You know, once he left, that pretty much ran off any lingering eyeballs that came back just to see Punk's run. Since that point, we see the end result. They've gone from easily cracking 1 million viewers to now starting to kind of look like Rampage numbers did a year or so ago. And this is supposed to be their A show. And I keep coming back to the same talking point. They need stars. They need names. They need some kind of believable storyline that isn't just aimed to please the fucking marks. I know most AEW fanatics will tell you they don't care about storylines. All they want to see are great wrestling matches. Okay. Well, take a look and see what happens when you try to pleasure that audience. You lose 200,000 viewers within the span of a year. And until Tony recognizes that problem, this is what you're going to keep getting. A wrestling product that's mainly appealing to the faithful minority. The people that are never going to leave the company. That are going to stick with it until the day it goes under. And any chance they have of gaining new eyeballs is immediately thrown under the bus. All at the expense of trying to appease the basement dwellers. Because again, Tony is listening to the wrong people. And he's either too ignorant to see it, or even worse, he's so self-confident that he's actually doing the right thing. That, I think, is the more egregious situation. The fact that he actually thinks that what he's doing is working. It's crazy. And either way, as we go by history, it doesn't end well. Anyway, what do you say we move on to the classic part of today's show? I think I spent enough time talking about AEW's problems. Kind of forgot that Friday's show also has a retro classic portion of the podcast, so yeah, we should probably talk about that. So let's go to Crockett Promotions. This would have been March 14th, 1987. And our cold open for this week was a little confusing at first glance. If you do not have any prior context, you probably would have sat there watching this like, wait, what's going on? The show starts with a VTR of the Horsemen leaving the ring after a match they had on the NWA Pro taping. While they're walking out, Ole Anderson gets into the ring and basically stands his ground, calling for everybody else to come back and meet him in the ring to pick a fight. And, of course, JJ's talking about how they've washed their hands of Ole, blah, blah. They want nothing to do with him anymore. That wasn't the confusing part. What was confusing was Jim Cornette and JJ are at the interview station with Bob Caudle, and at the time, I don't know, it looked like they were basically negotiating a hit job or something. So Corny basically asked JJ if he wants Big Bubba to take care of the deed now. JJ gives him the stamp of approval, and that's where they left us as we cut to the studio with Tony and David. Again, this warrants further elaboration as we cover that in the program, but as a cold open VTR, it was one of the more confusing ones I've seen. Like, there are elements to the Ole departure in Crockett that I'm still a little muddy on. I remember how they got from point A to point D, but points B and C are a little flaky. The part of how they actually kicked Ole out of the group. Now, Cornette did not directly factor into that picture, but apparently there was a Big Bubba Ole Anderson feud that I just totally erased from memory. It was like probably one of the last things Ole ever did before he left. But we'll get into that in a while. For now, we go to Tony and David for the opening spiel. And this is great. If you catch this in the right frame, right as they pitch to the booth, you see like a split frame where Ron Garvin's there saying something to Tony, and Tony's laughing. And right as Tony and David kind of run down the format of the program, that's when they bring Garvin and Barry Windham out for their promo. And they're basically doing the hype for one of the featured matches on the show. They are defending the U.S. Tag Team Championships today. They've been a successful unit since dethroning the Russians and winning the gold. And they're convinced that there isn't a team in wrestling today that can match their ability in the ring as a team. And that includes the Midnights. But those weren't their opponents, as we came to find out. They were actually wrestling Dick Murdoch and Ivan Koloff. Then pitching to our first match, it's Jimmy Garvin versus Randy Barber's shit-stained brown tights. To go along perfectly with his shit body and shit ring ability. Too harsh? Well, you know. I never claimed to be a nice guy. So Garvin worked him over for a few minutes, pulled out some of the Ronnie Garvin specials here, like the back rake, for example. Ended up going over with the brain buster. And then cutting back to the booth with Nikita Koloff and Dusty Rhodes. First words out of Nikita's mouth are, "Tony, I have a million things I want to talk about today." To which I said, how about we wrap this up in about a minute? Because I don't think I need to hear Nikita Koloff ramble on in broken English about a million topics. Be here for the next millennia. Basically, his subject material boiled down to three things, which is nowhere close to a million, but I'll just presume that math isn't Nikita's strong suit. He talked about an upcoming U.S. heavyweight title defense with Arn Anderson. Talked about Ivan, Vladimir, and Murdoch. Said that him and Dusty have not forgotten about them yet. And he said that even though him and Dusty are the number 2 seed in the Crockett Cup, it means they'll work that much harder than everybody else to be the number 1 seed. To which Dusty basically just reiterated all of Nikita's talking points. He basically had nothing to say. He did throw in a line at the end, talking about how he's coming back to the Garden in Boston to fight Big Baba. And it's going to be bad to the bone. My final note reads, Was there a point at all to this promo? Or was this literally just to fill time? I'm starting to think it was the latter. In any case, didn't take us long to get the follow-up with what happened in the opening montage. We found out what Cornette and Bubba were up to in that interview session with JJ. It was indeed a pre-planned hit job. And they had a lot of suspense building up to this. Probably figuring, oh man, I wonder if Ole's going to get his clock cleaned. Well, here's how the segment went. Bubba went down to attack Ole. Ole made his own comeback. And he ran off Big Bubba. That was it. That was the whole follow-up. The build-up from the first 30 seconds of the show. That was the popcorn fart payoff we got. No, that was a wasted investment on JJ's part. Paid Corny the big bucks to have his bodyguard take out Ole, and he failed. Well under a minute, too. Poor Jim. Hope he gave JJ his money back. Speaking of muggings and brutal attacks, I think JJ should have paid the Barbarian to try to attack Ole instead. Because that's what the Barbarian did to Zane Smith here in about 90 seconds. And still within that 90-second time frame, Zane Smith managed to fuck up a rope spot. Barbarian went to whip Smith off the ropes. Smith was supposed to run back so Barbarian could hit him with a sidewalk slam. And Smith just decided to sandbag Barbarian like an idiot. He did not want to go up. So Barbarian just kind of shrugged it off and shoved him down. Looked horrible. I did like the spot before that where the Barbarian went to tease throwing Smith out to the concrete from a military press position. Had I known the botch spot was coming with Smith a few seconds later, I'd have probably given Barbarian the green light to just throw him out to the floor. Bill Dundee was too nice. The onslaught went on for several minutes. Smith got blown up the longer it went. There was a point at the finish where Barbarian hit Smith with a very vertical-looking tombstone piledriver. It literally looked like Barbarian just picked up a cardboard cutout upside down and spiked it on its head. Smith, hanging with his legs straight up in the air like a statue, probably thinking to himself, well, this might be the moment that I die. May as well go out in style. And with Tony and David not being able to figure out that this move was still called the Tombstone, Barbarian hit a diving headbutt for the 3. At which point we came back from break for another pre-tape. This time it's Francis Crockett in Baltimore, putting over the city and trying to establish the story that they're excited to be hosting the 1987 Crockett Cup at this location. And when I tell you that Francis Crockett delivered this verbiage in the most boring, uninspiring manner imaginable, I am not kidding. She had the vocal intonation of, I am plainly reading this from a teleprompter right now. I really don't want to be here, but I'm getting paid to do it. She's talking about how the city's been in disrepair for a long time, but now they finally got the financial backing to start developing better homes and renovate all the buildings. It's beyond dry. I think my favorite part was her saying, and I think I got the inflection right with this, bet you aren't aware that the first Washington monument was erected here, or that Edgar Allan Poe's gravesite is here. Isn't that exciting? I'm so enthused to provide this stellar report to everybody. Not. I know, I'm being a dick. Nothing against Francis Crockett. I'm sure she was a lovely lady, just doing what she was told. But my God, talking about the epitome of zero energy. And apparently there's going to be a part 2 to this next week. So if you weren't already bored into a self-induced coma hearing Francis Crockett talk, I'll get ready, because she's back for more, talking about the Baltimore land sites and all the happenings of the 1987 Crockett Cup. Can't wait. So following that power nap, that took us to the U.S. Tag title match with Barry Windham and Ron Garvin defending against Dick Murdoch and Ivan Koloff. And if you know your NWA history moderately well, you'll probably recognize that this match was a pretty significant moment in the Crockett archives. Wouldn't say it's like a top 10 moment or anything like that. But this ended up resulting in a title switch by the end. Probably what was seen by a lot of people at the time, a fairly shocking title switch, especially with the way they sold it. You know, it was weird too because at least by this point, the U.S. tag titles in Crockett Promotions were relatively new belts. You know, they did that tournament in the fall of '86 to crown the inaugural champions. In a sense, they ended up taking the place of the national tag team titles. It sort of fizzled out when Ole was taken off of television with the kayfabe injury. Since the point Ivan and Crusher won the initial tournament, we have seen, I believe this was our third or fourth title switch in like 5 months. Technically, this match made Ivan Koloff a 2-time champion. I guess when you look at the timeline of where they were with Windham and Garvin, headed into the Crockett Cup after the fact too, yeah, it really didn't make a whole lot of sense for them to have the belts anymore. They were both already preoccupied with other programs that really didn't have much to do with the belts necessarily. You know, they were teasing that Eaton and Condrey wanted the belts, but in order for that title switch to occur, that meant they would have had to either beat Ronnie or Barry in the process. And, you know, while they hypothetically could have beaten them with bullshit chicanery, kind of like how this match ended, it still wouldn't have lent itself to keeping either guy strong, you know, especially as they were both being built up for world title shots independently. But to put the straps on Murdoch and Ivan of all teams, I don't know. It was just an odd decision. Because I've already talked about with the tournament how I think Dusty created the tournament because he wanted to eventually put the belts on the Midnights. And, you know, since he already had the Rock and Roll Express factored in the world title picture, or the world tag title picture, I should say, you know, there wasn't much of a sense in going back to the well with that feud again. You know, so the U.S. tag belts were a clever strategy to still give Eaton and Lane belts without directly involving them in the top programs. But then when I realized that Murdoch and Ivan won the belts here, I started wondering, well, okay, so how in the fuck do Eaton and Lane become the champions? Because obviously they're not going to do heel versus heel. That wouldn't make any sense. And I have no memory of Murdoch and Ivan's title reign. So I know the Midnights end up with the belts. I just have no clue how they get there. Unless they do an angle where the Russians drop the belts off camera, which would probably make the most sense. But I mean, my God, now you're talking about another very abrupt title switch out of the blue like that. It's like, why would you even bother putting the belts on them to begin with? And again, this is where my historical knowledge kind of gets a little hairy, you know, especially with the lower status feuds. And it's not to say the Midnight Express were lower status by this point, but you know, but they weren't necessarily being factored at the top in the pecking order around this point. They kind of had their run with the Rock and Roll Express and the Road Warriors, and now we've seen Dusty bring in and try to feature some new teams in that top role. Raging Bull and Rick Rude obviously being the champions now. But getting back to this match, you know, the action was a lot of fun. It had energy, had heat. The people were hot for it. Even though the setup for this was pretty out of the blue, you know, everything was just, hey, Ronnie and Barry are defending the belts on television this week. And their opponents, two guys they've had little to no interaction with in the last month. Now, all four guys worked very well together. They did a great job milking the heat spots. You know, Ivan and Murdoch worked over both Ronnie and Barry, respectively. Probably the guy with the most heat in the entire match was Captain Redneck, who everybody kept referring to as Traitor. And I just love how, of all terms in the English dictionary, it's the word traitor that gets under Dick Murdoch's skin. Can't stand being called a traitor like that. There's good stuff toward the middle part where things kind of broke down on the floor with everybody. Barry's in there trying to fire back, getting a few pin attempts. It was actually cool seeing Barry make his own comeback without having to resort to the formulaic hot tag spot to Ronnie. Because they had already done the hot tag earlier with Ronnie giving the one to Barry. And since they were running this through a series of commercials, they were actually trying to build up to that role reversal. But, they actually spent a period of tapping into the drama instead of going right to it. So I like that. And when the heels cut off Barry again, coming back for the final part of the match, now the fans could really start rallying behind Barry that much more to get that big tag save. I also don't think I'll ever be able to unhear David Crockett referring to Captain Redneck as, and I quote, Dickie. I hope to God that doesn't become a common theme over the next month, because I don't think I'll make it. If I have to hear Dave Crockett refer to him as Dickie every week on this show, I might shove nails in my ears. Now, obviously, by now in the match, the fatigue factor is kicking in for both teams. Barry, by this point, was taking a beating for at least a solid 10 minutes. They gave him some hope spots, but, the heels were there to quickly cut him off. Finally, Barry's able to hit Ivan with a running clothesline, gets that long-awaited hot tag to Ron Garvin. Here comes Garvin, a house of fire, flurry of offense at the end there. He ends up decking Ivan with a knockout blow. And while it breaks down with both teams, Scrappy McGowan ends up getting into, simply put, a scrap with Vladimir Pietrov. He tries to hit the ring, so the ref's dealing with him. And when Ron is over in the other corner trying to cover Ivan, who should appear from the other side of the studio but Jim Cornette and Bobby Eaton? Those no-good scumbags. We all forgot about those weasels. And Eaton ends up clocking Ron over the head with the loaded racket. Ronnie tumbles over like a falling building. Ivan lays one hand over his chest, and it's 1, 2, 3. New U.S. Tag Team Champions. The crowd is bemused. David Crockett sounds like he's on the verge of giving himself a hernia. He's so outraged. And we get about 20 seconds of Murdoch and Koloff doing the celebratory promo at the booth, playing off the idea that they had no idea what just happened, that they did this all on their own. And, kind of an unceremonious title dethroning, but that was how they got the belts off of Ronnie and Barry. They factored everything into the ongoing issues between Garvin and the Midnight Express. We were so caught up in the stuff currently going on with Ivan and Murdoch versus the Superpowers, Barry Windham's upcoming world title shot with Flair in Baltimore for the title, we neglected to mention that Ronnie is currently involved with the Midnights right now. A lot of layered storylines going on. And it turns out they were the deciding factor in all this. So, of course, here they are after the commercial break, boasting and jesting and scoffing at the whole situation. Corny's playing dumb about the whole title switch, claiming that he was on the phone with Mama Cornette in the back talking about stockbrokers. But ain't it a damn shame that Ronnie Garvin lost the U.S. tag belts like that? Guess it's solidified that Murdoch and Koloff are the superior tag team. Of course, he's running down the Garvin brothers for a while, throwing shade at Jimmy and Precious. While he's running Jimmy up the flagpole for coming out here with his bimbo wife, Precious. His words, not mine. Is that even a derogatory term people use to describe women anymore? Most of the time I just hear people call them sluts and whores. Bimbo's kind of an outdated term these days. And the big gag here, after basically inferring that Precious has her own hooker phone line, Jim then pulls out a box of dog treats, says they'll do a fine job cleaning her teeth. And, classic corny stuff. He also promised us that he was going to do everything in his power to make sure his attorneys get that cage match with him and Garvin canceled. It may go on until they grow long white beards, but we can rest assured That match will never happen. And he also blabbed on about some stuff pertaining to the Crockett Cup that I did not bother writing down. He talked faster than my fingers were capable of typing, and I just kind of gave up trying after a while. The only part of the dialogue I remembered was something about him referencing Dennis Condrey driving 18 different sports cars. I did not know Dennis was a car enthusiast, but maybe that was kayfabe. So, with that all said, okay, keep in mind, everything we've covered in the last 15 to 20 minutes of programming, we've had a U.S. tag title match that went through 3 segments, on top of all the chaotic heat angles that went on at the finish, plus a title switch, followed by a great heel promo from the team that just fucked over the previous babyface champions. So naturally, their next match, just to keep things relatively up-tempo after all that great TV we just experienced, it is Brad Armstrong versus El Labo. It was kind of the equivalent of them serving you a steak dinner with mashed potatoes and green beans, and then the dessert is a bowl of vanilla pudding. Not to try and insinuate that Brad was vanilla pudding in the ring. Far from it. He was a very great athlete. Good professional wrestler. Never had a bad word to say about the guy. But the reality is that I am sitting here watching Brad Armstrong wrestle a job guy named El Labo after everything I just saw in the previous 4 segments. My notes read as follows. They wrestled a match. It went on for way too long. It actually went through a commercial break for whatever reason. Brad won with the leg sweep. I've literally nothing else to say about it. Then we went over to the booth for a Bullet Bob Brad promo. And Bob's running down all the competition in the Crockett Cup. Along the way, making sure he gets in his jabs at the bad guys in total Southern delivery. I liked at one point, he compared Dick Benedict Murdoch to the north end of a southbound mule. Boy, is that ever a Bullet Bob line. Then Brad chimed in with some thoughts here. Totally winded in his delivery, but he basically got out that he and his dad are training hard for the best the world has to offer in this tournament. Says that Bullet Bob wrote the book on smash mouth jaw jacking, and the Armstrongs are here to prove that they're among the best of the competition in the Crockett Cup. I guess it would what you would call the underdog duo. With that said, it's time to pick things up again. Because then we had this Ole promo from the NWA Pro taping. And, well, suffice it to say, there aren't a lot of instances where I'll watch something that's so damn good the first go-around that I literally have to pause the video feed and rewind it to watch it again. It's that good. Like, there are plenty of times where I'll see something that's so horrifically botched, or maybe a piece of dialogue that I missed and I wanted to make sure that I heard it correctly. Then I'll go back and rewind it to watch it again. I watched this Ole promo from start to finish, and it left me so mesmerized by the end of it. I actually went back and watched it a second time because I loved it that much. And the whole premise behind the promo is Tony trying to get Ole's input on everything that's been going down with the Horsemen. We've heard from JJ and Tully's perspective, but we're yet to hear Ole's side of the story. It starts off relatively calm and laid back. Ole's talking about how he hasn't spoken with Flair yet. With Arn, he's obviously still trying to soak a lot of this in, so he's at least giving him the benefit of the doubt. As for Luger, Ole sees a lot of hope and promise in him, but he's making a big mistake aligning himself with the likes of JJ and Tully, who are the real troublemakers in this whole ordeal. And it all boils down to the simple fact that men like JJ and Tully are so self-absorbed that they'll put their own needs above everything and anybody else, up to and including their own family. He says, They were so quick to throw Ole's son under the bus, and Ole's lived a long enough life to recognize that there are certain things that you prioritize above business. And yes, that includes family, because family comes first. And the fact that JJ and Tully had the gall, the temerity to mention Ole's snot-nosed kid on live broadcast television, all that does is signify the kind of men they are. And while everybody in the Horsemen have been talking about how Ole just isn't cutting it anymore, how he's lost the fire in his eyes, well, there's still plenty of fire burning from Ole's perspective. And as long as he's still breathing and kicking, he has enough fire left to break some arms and snap some ligaments. But this time, he's not going to do it for the Horsemen. He's going to do it for that snot-nosed kid of his. The one that's the center of his world. And obviously, I'm totally underselling the greatness of this promo. Again, I watched it back twice in a row. If you're one of those wrestling fans out there that truly value the importance of wrestling promos, you have to go out of your way to find this somewhere on YouTube. Or better yet, if you have the Cox subscription, go to the March 14th, 1987 episode of World Championship Wrestling on the Superstation, skip to around the 50-minute mark of the show, and just watch this friggin' thing from start to finish. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. Ole fucking Anderson, of all people, cut one of the best babyface promos you'll probably ever hear in your entire life. And if you know anything about the reputation of Ole Anderson in the business, that ought to tell you something. The fact that that guy could cut one of the most believable good guy promos you would ever hear. Wow. Made you really fear for the general well-being of the other members of the Horsemen, mainly Tully and JJ. Speaking of said individuals, Arn, Luger, and Tully wrestled Alan Martin, Bill Mulkey, and Larry Stevens. And while the match was nothing short of your typical Horseman massacre, David and Tony sold the fact that all three men were watching the monitor. They saw that Ole interview from beginning to end. So they put over the idea that these guys are going to be looking over their shoulder because Ole is out for blood. And the problem for the Horsemen is that Ole's out for their blood. And again, it's so great with the way they're working this story. They got all these multi-layered circumstances. Everybody in the Horsemen are in different stages trying to process all this. You know, JJ and Tully are pretty much off the Ole bandwagon. That relationship is pretty much broken. Arn's still kind of troubled by it because he still has that familial bond with Ole and kayfabe. But, you know, he also established in the promo earlier that he's also a Horseman through and through. Luger's sort of the I don't really give a fuck personality in all this. Like, he just wants to be a Horseman. And if that means throwing Ole under the bus to get to that spot, he'll do it. And again, you know, Flair's been super quiet the whole time. Hasn't spoken a word about the entire situation. So we're yet to hear where he stands. Again, there's a lot going on here. Everything kind of layers over itself. They're milking a lot of angles all at once, and everything makes perfect sense. It's actually kind of very similar to how great a job WWE's done with the Bloodline story. Because we've seen the same essential story elements with the Sami Zayn breakup and how Roman and the Usos were dealing with everything back in January. Now that we know Jay is back on board with the Bloodline, that story's kind of changed since then. But when Jay was still kind of on the fence about everything, didn't know where he stood, there were a lot of multi-layered themes going on for that period of time. Now, the Horseman story isn't the same thing entirely, but there are some similarities there. You know, and JJ kind of put a cap to all this by briefly mentioning in his promo that the Horsemen have worked out the kinks. They had a major announcement for later on that they wanted to make regarding the future of the group. And we had Arn out there doing a follow-up promo after the commercial directed at Ole. He mentions that Ole was very passionate about defending his son, but when he talks about family and putting family first, Arn and the rest of the Horsemen are family, at least from the way he sees it. It wasn't Ole that was spotting Arn in the gym or taking him out to all the fancy restaurants. That was totally JJ and Flair, the guys that pushed Arn and motivated him to go above and beyond. So for Arn, he sees it differently than Ole does. The Horsemen did not turn their back on Ole. It was Ole that turned his back on the Horsemen. And frankly, Arn's sick of waiting around. He and Ole aren't the tag team champions anymore, and it's obvious Ole isn't going to be in the right headspace to ever go after the tag team gold again. So Arn's just going to take a different path, and he's going to turn his attention to Nikita Koloff and the U.S. heavyweight title, the one man in Crockett Promotions that the Horsemen are yet to topple. But for Arn, he's putting Ole in the back of his mind, which also means for the Crockett Cup, JJ is going to have to bring in a replacement partner to team with Arn. And who would that man be? None other than Kevin Sullivan, who I believe was name dropped for the very first time on television. And, yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot of material to digest there. I guess, for one, I need to backtrack a little on my previous statement because, I said that Arn was one of the troubled souls that really couldn't decide whether or not he was on Ole's side in all this. I mean, I gotta say, based on the delivery in his promo, pretty much seemed like he was done with Ole. So much so that he willingly sacrificed a spot in the Crockett Cup to get a replacement partner. But, again, this is all great stuff. I can't put it over enough. Like, y'all want to talk about the art of professional wrestling that's missing today, the great storytelling. Well, here it is, plain as day. Don't get much any better than what's been going on with the Horsemen breakup circa 1987. As quickly as it all came together, it's totally believable with the way everybody's been situated in the story. And it's not like what we see today where factions and teams break up for literally no discernible reason, and everybody usually glosses over it on television or completely forgets to even mention it. And then we're left wondering why the fuck people vanish from the show for weeks on end. And there's other problems too with the way factions split in today's product anyway. The biggest problem a lot of the time is that you look at most of the people that are grouped together in factions anymore, a lot of the time it's just random people on the roster being shoehorned into groups, even if they have nothing in common with each other. And the end result is that people don't get over and the fans don't care. The Firm? Dare I say any more? I mean, I could throw the Jagoff Asshole Society in that conversation pool too, but then I'd have to give Jericho more unwarranted attention, and that's exactly what he wants people like me to do. But, that's a topic I can delegate an entire podcast to if I wanted to. Anyway, moving on with things. I'm going to try and pick up a little bit here. Lasertron, a.k.a. not Hector Guerrero under a mask, wrestled Tommy Angel. Junior heavyweight champion Lasertron, in case you already forgot about that, who just recently beat Danny Brown on last week's show, in his TV debut, no less. And you want to know what the hilarious thing is? They booed Denny Brown out of the building in that title match last week. Like, Lasertron became an instant babyface in that match. People went nuck and futz for that title switch. Here, in this match, the studio crowd was chanting for Tommy Angel. Yeah, I don't get it either. They wrestled for several minutes. Hector did some flashy stuff. The crowd just kind of sat on their hands for a lot of it. And he ended up going over with some kind of running clothesline off the ropes that kind of resembled Raging Bull's flying burrito, but not really. I don't know what you call it. We'll just call it the flying taco as a placeholder name until I can think of something more clever to name it. Then we came back for a Midnight Express squash. They wrestled Mike Jackson and Dexter Westcott. Now, yes, this is still technically Beautiful Bobby and Loverboy Dennis. I know we're also coming up on the abrupt departure of Dennis relatively soon. I think within the next couple weeks. Man, that sucks. Just when Eaton and Condrey decided to coordinate matching gear, too. Obviously, I'm kidding. Eaton and Jackson did some fun back and forth at the beginning. Cornette making sure to get in his jabs at Mike by talking about how they need to book him and the fake Martian in a match for the junior heavyweight title on television. I like how even in 1987, Cornette wasn't afraid to just bury stupid gimmicks outright. I'm surprised he didn't just say, Hector under the alien mask. Now, obviously, in addition to Cornette's commentary on what was happening with the Midnights, he made sure to also follow up on the Big Bubba Ole Anderson footage. Basically reiterated the talking point that JJ paid him a good sum of money to put Ole out of commission, and that he and Bubba are going to make sure they collect. I can also confirm 100%, they never actually showed this on camera, but you remember how earlier in the show, Cornette was out there with a box of dog treats, making fun of Precious? I think Corny pulled out that box again and offered some to David and Tony here. I'm watching these guys wrestle in the ring. Off camera, I hear what appear to be rattling sounds. I presume it was the dog treats. Albeit I didn't write much down about the actual in-ring stuff. Dennis and Bobby were so great at the subtle things. And that was mainly the material I jotted down. Things like Dennis putting Westcott in the abdominal stretch while Cornette was trying to fan him with the tennis racket. Or Bobby playing with the guys on the mat and then rolling them on top of him to tease pinfalls. And my personal favorite, what happened at the end. The Midnights hit the rocket launcher, and then Eaton takes about a full minute to pretend like he cannot figure out how to turn the guy over to pin his shoulders down. And then he just ends up laying a finger on the guy's chest. And I know a lot of modern fans would look at shit like that today and think, oh, that's ridiculous. Look at how Bobby and Dennis are just burying these guys, acting like jackasses on television like that. To which I respond by saying, they were fucking with a guy named Dexter Westcott. Cool your jets. After that, we came back for a Rock and Roll Express promo. Been a few weeks since we've seen Ricky and Robert on the show. Not sure what they've been up to. I know the Road Warriors were off in Japan around this point, which is why we haven't seen them on the show. Not sure about the Rock and Roll Express, though. Still gunning for those World Tag Team Championships, though. Still calling out Paul Jones, Raging Bull, and Rick Rude. Still can't understand a goddamn word Robert Gibson says more often than not. And I think Ricky mentioned something about burning Baltimore to the ground during the Senior Memorial Crockett Cup. There was literally no other point to this promo. And then they went into the ring to wrestle Mike Dalton and Randy Mulkey, wherein I think the highlight of the entire segment was Ricky giving Scrappy McGowan a double high five. And Scrappy completely no-sold it. Ricky was actually a highlight during this. I have no idea why, but he was very amped up. He even did the old Midnight Express spot where he drags the job guy over to the corner to tag the other partner in. Then afterwards, he did a wacky little dance. They went over with the double drop kick. But, yeah, and I'm not sure what Ricky was so hyped up for in this match. Maybe he was just excited to be back on television. Who knows? But now we've come to the important JJ announcement. He promised that by the end of the program, he was going to make a public service announcement regarding the future of the Four Horsemen. And drum roll, please. The big reveal. Lex Luger is the fourth horseman. Officially. Which I think we already kind of figured was coming anyway. And Luger was out there to kind of share his input on it. And this Luger promo. This Luger promo. It has been said many a times, by me as a matter of fact, that Lex Luger's promos were very hit and miss throughout his career. Sometimes he was firing on all cylinders. Other times he was bumbling and fumbling his way through dialogue and falling flat on his face. This was an unfortunate example of the latter. He's desperately trying to get out the fact that he stayed quiet through the whole ordeal, to let the cards fall where they may. And the entire time Luger's talking, the fans are just raining down chants of Ole. And you can tell this really threw Luger off his game because he's trying to get out his dialogue. You can tell he's losing his train of thought midway through. He's got like this blank expression on his face. Every so often he'd say a sentence, he'd pause, he'd look down with frumpy face, and then he would look back up at the camera to say a few more words, and they would look back down with frumpy face again. Meanwhile, JJ's there clearly trying to guide him along, saying, "I apologize for the rude interruption." And while I'm laughing the whole way through this promo, watching frump-face Luger, like you can tell he's fucking pissed, it basically ends with him storming off set, and JJ promises to all the studio fans that he's going to have every single one of them individually ejected on next week's show, just for being dicks. Poor Lex. And honestly, to be fair, you can't blame him. He was green. He hadn't been used to getting heckled to this degree by a lot of the fans. You could tell this legitimately got under his skin. It's happened plenty of times throughout the history of wrestling. You know, certain guys are better at hiding it than others, but yeah. Frumpy face Luger, that's a sight you can never unsee. I mean, he was never the best at hiding when he was visibly angry about something. See his WrestleMania 10 match with Yokozuna as a clear-cut example. What did Corny title it? I think he called it Boo Boo Job Face. This was Boo Boo Promo Face. I felt so bad for him. But I got a kick out of it. Speaking of bad promos, Paul Jones. End of sentence. So, here's what I wrote down about this promo with him, Rude, and Bull. Tell me if you think this is pretty accurate of any Paul Jones promo you've ever heard. This was an actual sentence that he uttered during this segment. And I quote, "Our game plan up until April 10th and 11th is, well, our operation game plan is Operation Elimination." Huh? Was that even English? I swear to God, man, I am convinced that when Paul Jones was sent out there to do promos on these shows, I guarantee you he just went out there with his thumb up his ass. He said, fuck it, whatever words that droop from my mouth, that's what we're going with. One take. He's just train wreck horrible on the microphone. It's hilarious. Rude was a little more straightforward. I did note during his promo, only a ravishing Rick Rude could pull off a totally shirtless look, but he can still rock the fucking gold watch. What a champ. And, Bull kind of reiterated some old talking points, said they're the best team in Crockett Promotions. He really didn't have a whole lot to say. But my God, that Paul Jones line. Write that one down. I think that might be an all-timer. Operation Elimination should be eliminating Paul Jones from ever having a live mic in front of his mouth ever again. And then we went to the ring for our main event. Mike Rotunda wrestled one of the Thunderfoots. I think it was Thunderfoot number 1. And after last week's obvious botch from David referring to him as Mike Rotundo, well, you got it right this week. They wrestled for a few minutes. Rotunda clearly botched trying to get Thunderfoot up in the airplane spin position, so he audibled and hit him with a vertical suplex, and then he went to whip him off the ropes. He then picked him up for the airplane spin DVD combo and got the pin. And then he did the whitest white meat of all white meat babyface promos. Closing things out, he talked about the Crockett Cup for a minute, plugged that he and Tim Horner were ready to compete. He talked about his upcoming Florida Heavyweight Championship match. And then he put over that he's gunning for gold in the NWA, saying that if you put your mind to it and stick the course, you can accomplish all of your goals. Basically came off like a watered-down Jordan Peterson promo. When it was over, I thought, maybe turning this guy heel was a good call. I'm partially being facetious. But that's all there was to it. And needless to say, the show kind of fell off a cliff in the last 20 minutes. It was the embodiment of, I have virtually nothing to say about any of these segments, but I am desperately trying to come up with material to talk about. Not because of the fact that they were bad segments, but they were literally just segments. And between the Luger promo that totally went sideways in a hurry, Paul Jones being Paul Jones, and Rotunda giving me a semi-inspirational speech about how I can achieve all my dreams if I set my mind to it, I'm like, yeah, this isn't really following the Ole Arn material from earlier on. That also could have been part of the problem too. Promo-wise, we went from Ole to Arn to Luger to Paul Jones to Mike Rotunda. Not what you would call a vast improvement. Joking aside, though, the Horseman material was easily the best thing on the entire show, no question. And, while the reveal of Luger being the fourth Horseman wasn't exactly groundbreaking, they at least moved the needle a little bit here in the story. They phased Ole out, and now we're basically riding with our second of many, 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 many Four Horsemen incarnations we would come to find over the years. They never topped the original core group, but, at least by this period, they still had the general foundation. Speaking of the general foundation, yeah, I don't know. I literally had no lead into this. I just shot from the hip with that transition and utterly failed. Everyone feel free to admonish me. World Class. The show. Let's go. This was, what the hell episode was this? March 17th, 1984, looks like. I've done a rotten job actually mentioning the dates for these retro shows. I need to start getting into a habit of doing that. I mean, I know it says it in the title, but for my sake, I probably should just make mention of the dates. Because you never know. I could easily title the wrong date on the video, and then everything will get out of sync. So far, I don't think I've butchered anything, but you never know with me. Anyway, this show was kind of a similar format to last week. There was definitely a little more story advancement, which was good. We saw a lot of new faces show up last time, so that played more into the ring work we got this week. A third of the program was them actually replaying the angle from last week with Chris Adams stripping Jimmy Garvin of his clothes, which, we can touch on a little more when we get to that part of the report. We did get another Hacksaw Bush Reed squash. He wrestled Mike Bond. And if you want to hear me elaborate more on the breakdown of the career of Mr. Butch Reed, you can go listen to my world-class review from last week where I covered a lot of that in finer detail. He had gone through a few switches between face and heel during his run. By this point in early 84, he was full-fledged heel, no question. Off the top of my head, I don't think I would be able to tell you what he was involved with in the Mid-South region. I mean, I have to presume whatever he was doing at the time, he was obviously working heel. He did a lot of gyrating as a bad guy. It was quite the visual at times. You know, it's interesting, and I don't think I covered a lot of this last time. You know, I've seen a lot of Butch Reed matches. Generally, when you compare him to a lot of the more athletically built guys in the day, or back in the day, I don't think you hear a lot of people talking about Butch Reed being a great in-ring technician, because objectively speaking, he really wasn't. Like, he could move. He had some athletic ability in terms of being able to do leapfrogs and arm drags and drop kicks, things of that nature. But I think what set Reed apart from a lot of other guys was his ability to just be a natural personality. Whether he was trash talking in the ring, crowd taunting, what have you. You know, again, I always kind of go back to my talking point of the subtle things. Butch Reed was really good at that. You don't really talk much about Butch Reed having great classic technical showcases, but definitely for a bigger guy, the guy was solid for what he could do in the ring. And, you know, that could have been part of the issue, too. You factor in that he primarily worked in Mid-South for the bulk of his career, later in '87 for the WWF. Those are two companies that heavily spotlighted bigger guys. Bill Watts sort of adapted his talent pool around '84 and '85 and started to showcase the more agile, athletic moving guys. But like '82 and '83, like go back and look at those Mid-South tapings. That roster was 90% big dudes. So, to be fair, for a lot of Butch Reed's run, you know, he didn't get a chance to work with a lot of smaller guys and didn't really get a chance to work the faster pace in the ring. And then, of course, there's the whole run in WCW in the early 90s where he basically floundered, and I try to forget most of that stuff ever happened. But, you know, it's an interesting subject to bring up if you have people that enjoy classic content. They ended up shooting an angle afterwards here with him and the Iceman. They did a cool face-off where Butch bailed out at the end. So that'll be a program to look forward to on Dallas TV. Surely won't complain about an Iceman King Parsons Hacksaw Butch Reed feud. I mean, the people popped a boner as soon as both guys made eye contact. Can only imagine how much it's going to blow the roof off the joint when they finally touch for the first time. Speaking of popping wood and people being way too excited for shit, Mike Von Erich wrestled Michael Hayes. Looking at this on paper, my wince reflexes immediately kicked in. But then I quickly came to my senses and realized, wait a minute. It's a fucking Freebirds Von Erich match. People are going to go ballistic for this. What am I thinking? And that they did. I believe, according to Bill Mercer, the first actual in-ring bout between these two specific men. Man, thinking about all the Von Erich Freebirds combinations we've seen in the last 14 to 15 months, I thought we saw just about every mathematical equation you could come up with. Turns out I left out Mike. Forgot all about him. Nah, but this is really solid. You know, what Mike always lacked for in terms of charisma when it came to his work in the ring, Hayes made up for it in spades. But it was really a nice counterbalance when you factor in that Hayes wasn't always the best in-ring technician himself, but, you know, he could do all the bumping and overselling and feed for Mike. He had the personality to get it over. The people went crazy anytime Hayes was getting worked over or in any jeopardy. They never really did anything outside the standard norm of what you would expect for a match. It was all very fundamental stuff, minus the extended angle from Hayes, in which they kind of utilized more at the end. Mike Von Erich went flying into him after Hayes ducked the leapfrog attempt. He ended up dumping Mike over the top rope to the floor, which would have ended in a disqualification had Bronco seen it. And of course, he goes for the foul play cover, but Mike Von Erich ends up kicking out at 2. And after Hayes spent way too much time playing with his food, he tries to do the cocky stack up on Mike, but ended up getting rolled through and having his shoulders pinned. Big upset. You know, the whole thing went probably less than 8 minutes altogether, which is pretty par for the course with Michael Hayes matches. But again, it's one of those things that I constantly complain about with today's product. The fact that matches go on for way too goddamn long and take way too long to get to the point. They did everything here you could possibly ask for. They kept it all reasonably under 10 minutes. No one had to dislocate an elbow to get it over, too. Imagine that. Obviously you'll be hearing the Freebirds try to downplay this on television in the coming weeks. I can already hear the Michael Hayes excuses in my head. It was a fluke. It never happened. It was a decoy, Michael Hayes. I injured my shoulder. Therefore, it didn't count. And I couldn't kick out. Don't put anything past Michael Hayes. And then they'll ask Mike Von Erich to cut a promo about it, and he'll just wind up staring into the camera with bum face. On the topic of people with bum faces, truthfully, I don't even know what you would call the expression on the missing link's face the majority of the time. It's like a cross between him attempting to look mad and trying to squeeze out a 2-day turd. That's about all I got out of this 2-minute video they aired, where Link was beating up a bunch of people on TV. Their caption read before the break, "Get ready to beat your head." Which is exactly what I wanted to do watching this unfold in front of my eyes. I think I would rather go beat my meat. But God bless them. They're trying to get over this horrible gimmick. It's not working. But on the other side of the coin, my favorite part of the show, easily, gorgeous Jimmy Garvin's reaction to him being stripped on last week's TV show. Well, the long and short of it is, he's not happy. And even better, while he's ranting and raging and snorting fire out of every hole in his body, there's Bill Mercer, calmly sitting there at the booth, trying to encourage Garvin to relive the footage with him in real time. And of course, Garvin is not having any of this. So, they cut back to the show where Mercer is happily saying, well, we know that Jimmy Garvin doesn't want to see the footage again. So let's watch it anyway. And that we did. Now, of course, if you missed last week's review, you're going to have no idea what I'm referring to in all this. Basically, what happened was, there was a TV match between Chris Adams and Kelly Kiniski. During the final minute, Precious and Jimmy Garvin came waltzing through the crowd to try to run a distraction on Adams. Turns out they managed to actually get Adams to turn his attention away for like 3 seconds so Kiniski could steal the win. And of course, because Garvin is an idiot, he could not leave well enough alone. He already stole Chris Adams' American Heavyweight title in an angle that happened off camera that we never saw, so he's out there wearing the belt around his waist and showboating it to the crowd. Meanwhile, he's mocking Adams over losing the match. He had the perfect opportunity to just turn around and walk away. So when he goes to point and laugh, Adams pulls him into the ring, starts beating the total titty fuck out of this guy. And to make matters even more degrading for the man, Adams not only gets his belt back, but to add insult to injury, he begins pulling apart Jimmy Garvin's ring attire, minus the ring trunks, thank heaven. So when Garvin came to and realized that his gear was stolen, he was quite angry. And again, the solution was very simple. All he had to do was walk away like a coward the moment he cost Chris Adams that match. But no. Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin gonna gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. What are you gonna do? And all of it fell perfectly into place for our TV main event. It's Chris Adams teaming with the Iceman to wrestle the Missing Link and Jimmy Garvin. Boy, talk about a dysfunctional heel team. Jimmy drew the short straw on that one. To make matters worse for the guy, there's Chris Adams out there wearing Garvin's ring gear. Robe, gloves, pads, the whole gamut. Just trying to make a whole mockery out of the Garvin situation. And as expected, shit hit the fan almost immediately. All four guys went right after each other. Adams and Garvin were tussling around momentarily while Bronco Lubitsch was being the most ineffective referee in the history of mankind. Not that he was about to engage in the middle of a four-way brawl. If you take a look at Bronco for 1 minute, he was not, as you would say, mobile. But the heels were able to isolate the faces and work them over. They had a fun teaser spot at one point where Sunshine chased Precious around the ring and almost got her. Almost got a handful of her. But she broke away in time for the heels to kind of chase Sunshine back around to the other side of the ring. In addition to all the pandemonium going on during this, by far the most captivating thing the entire time, it's watching the missing link sell. I don't even know how to describe it. Well, it's horrible for one, but it's also hilariously bad. I mean, it's like watching Handsome Jimmy sell. Like, you know the shit's awful, but you can't help but laugh at the same time. There's a point where Missing Link misses a charge in the corner to the Iceman, and instead of him just staggering back a few steps and falling over, he has to rapidly backpedal like a Scooby-Doo cartoon character, and then he essentially flip bumps over and lands on his stomach. I'm like, seriously, Shawn Michaels didn't oversell that much. Ridiculous. I also felt bad for Adams at one point here. He totally whiffed a thrust kick to Garvin during the comeback, and it was so poorly mistimed, Garvin couldn't even pretend to sell it. Right in plain view of the camera, too. You know, everyone worked hard, though. Some better than others. I mean, the missing link worked. I don't know if I could say it was good working, but it was working. But they ended up breaking down into the big four-way at the end again. Link ended up headbutting Adams over the top rope to the floor, which apparently did not directly lead to the DQ finish. Instead, Link ended up giving Adams an illegal diving headbutt, which then prompted Bronco to call for the DQ. And the babyfaces ended up clearing the ring pretty quickly afterwards, and Adams got to keep Garvin's ring gear, which all the people popped for. And they did the standoff where Adams draped the coat on the ring mat and challenged Garvin to come try and grab it. But he chickened out. But that kind of put a nice cap to the show. You know, the people liked the story of Adams fucking with Garvin and making him look like a weasel. And that bit never gets old. It was a pretty heavy babyface over episode. You know, even with Butch Reed getting that win in the opening match, the Iceman face-off with him got kind of the bigger reaction. But, yeah, a lot of babyfaces triumphing on this show. Well, you know, it's not unusual with Dallas TV, I guess. You know, they were pretty known for putting the good guys over on most occasion. Maybe the heels would get their heat back a time or two, but it wasn't as common. Again, you have to keep in mind, too, we're still operating in a post-David Von Erich time right now. They're still a little ways out from the David Memorial event at the Texas Stadium. I forget, I don't think that's until early May. So there's still a little bit of ways out to set up the card for that show. You know, a lot of the programming seems to be about getting over the newer faces or bringing back some of the resurfacing names. Next week, I think they said we're going to see the return of the Super Ds, which means that Skandar Akbar probably won't be too far behind. You know, overall, though, you look at the general morale with the product, things are still relatively hot. The fans are still into the product. Despite the David tragedy, business was still doing moderately okay. You know, things don't really start going off the rails until the whole fallout with Fritz and Crockett in '86. Obviously, the disbanding of the World Class from the National Wrestling Alliance, which meant that Flair was not going to be able to wrestle in the Dallas region anymore. You know, that was kind of the turning point. But something we'll cover later on once we actually see how all that television unfolds. But I think we're about ready to wrap things up for this one. Got a big weekend coming up here. Talked about last week, I went out of my way to start watching the WrestleMania 10 show, because we're going to factor that in with the retro part of the upcoming Monday podcast. I finished everything, got all my notes typed up, so we're in good shape there. All I need to do is catch up on the follow-up Retro Raw, as well as whatever WWE SmackDown is going to be presenting this Friday night. So it'll be a little longer Monday podcast than normal, but that'll be fun. I have some thoughts about that WrestleMania 10 card. It's been a while since I've gone back and seen the whole show again. So it'll all be discussed in detail. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. And make sure you come back to check out the Monday show, because it's going to be fun. Just like the FSWR podcast is every week. Fun. Engaging. Enticing. Mouth-watering, if you will. At least I try to make it such. I don't always succeed, but I give it the old college try. Anyway, have a good weekend, everyone. Take care. Peace out.